Welcome to the Cigar Caucus, where politics isn't just policy, it's personal. Around this table, we trade stories, not sound bites. Well, maybe a few sound bites. We light up not just cigars, but the kind of conversations that remind us why public service matters. It's about friendship, memory, and the moments between the headlines. And today, we're honored to continue that tradition. Charlie Bass didn't just serve New Hampshire, he embodied it. A Dartmouth man with deep family roots in public service, Charlie brought a kind of quiet integrity to Congress that's harder to find these days. He represented New Hampshire's 2nd District across 7 terms, never chasing headlines, but always showing up prepared, principled, and pragmatic, whether it was energy policy, environmental stewardship, or his favorite, budget discipline, and much needed. Charlie approached every issue with a kind of thoughtful moderation that made him a trusted voice on both sides of the aisle. He served on heavyweight committees, energy and commerce, intelligence, the budget committee, and he was instrumental in bipartisan efforts like the Brownfields Revitalization Act, which helped clean up and reinvest in forgotten corners of America. But what really sets Charlie apart isn't just his resume, it's his temperament. He's the kind of guy who could debate fiercely, then share a cigar and a laugh afterward. That's why he fits so naturally into the spirit of the Cigar Caucus: civil discourse, mutual respect, and a belief that friendship can outlast politics. So, Charlie Bass, former congressman, honored to have you today. Thanks for joining us from the famous barn that I have seen so often up in New Hampshire. So, Charlie, you come.
Let me interrupt you here.
You feel free. This is a conversation.
That rather flowery and possibly definitely exaggerated introduction. But what you didn't mention is what I really like, and that's the mechanics of the American Industrial Revolution, most notably in automobiles, but also in other instruments such as reproducer pianos and slot machines and clocks and all kinds of other things. If you can take it apart, I like it. I also have a long history in public service, as you mentioned. So I want to give due credit to this little car behind me, which is a 1915 Ford Model T center door sedan, a rather rare car. But I ask your viewers to think to themselves, what would America be today if Henry Ford had never been born? With that non-political thing, go for it.
You know, I actually think you love collecting cars and studying cars and building cars more than you love politics. And we're glad to talk about that. We're going to talk a little bit about politics today, though, and where the state of politics is in the day in which we live. But let's start with your family, because you have, I think, one of the most amazing family legacies, New England roots, imaginable. Your father, your grandfather, and then we want to talk on your maternal side, the Mitchell family. So you just start where you want, but tell us a little bit about your family legacy.
Well, I don't like to talk about myself. I find it rather boring to people listening. But, I grew up in a world where the issues of the day were dinner table conversation, even when I was too young to understand what anybody was saying. And I recall clearly being at my grandmother's house and becoming quite anxious because my father and my mother and my grandparents appeared to be fighting at the dinner table. And afterwards, I said to my mother, "Why are you guys fighting like this?" She said, "Oh, no. We're debating this issue or that issue. There's nothing acrimonious about it. We're expressing our views, and that's what makes our country work, because different people with different views can listen to one another." And then if you roll all the way forward to the little group that you and I and others formed about 10 years ago, it's the same thing, because we have people who we get together 3 times a week for an hour or so, and they're Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, African American, Jewish, evangelical, Baptist, Episcopal, and we can talk about issues and respect each other for that. Now, as far as my family goes,
let me interrupt you, Charlie. What you just described is the genesis of this podcast, the Cigar Caucus. It has its roots in the
Well,
relationships and the friendships that we developed over a cigar. Now, go ahead.
and it's changed us all a little bit, because look at yourself, Senator. You're much more tolerant, I think, than you were when you were actually in public life. I've learned a lot about issues that I sort of assumed I knew everything and I was right and everybody else was wrong. And I realized that these are complex times. The issues are complex, and and the rancor uh, that exists, although it's been around since the country was founded, it seems to have reached a feverish pitch at this point. Getting back to my family, however, you're right. My grandfather served as governor. He bolted the Republican Party when he was governor to endorse Teddy Roosevelt, whom he knew quite well, who was a candidate for president against William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson. We know what happened there. The Republican Party split. My grandfather immediately had just married my grandmother, and he took off for a round the world trip, sort of a very extended honeymoon. And in those days, the legislature elected the U.S. senators by majority vote of all the legislators. Well, there was a faction in the Bull Moose Party that was elected to the legislature, and they nominated my grandfather to be in the U.S. Senate, but all it did was spoil the Woodrow Wilson, William Howard Taft vote so that they couldn't get a majority. And no one could reach my grandfather until well into the end of the summer, early fall. And when he found out, he was horrified, and he said, I will not be a candidate for the Senate. Uh, and and then they went ahead. So New Hampshire didn't actually have a U.S. senator for 8 or 9 months. Um, Fast forward to my father, who was elected to the legislature and then the state senate, and he served there.
Now,
He was immediately elected.
what was his first name? It was
Perkins
Perkins.
Bass. And he was elected to the legislature and to the Senate, and then 2 years later to the Senate. And as a freshman senator, he was elected Senate president, which was fine. I guess did a decent enough job. However, in the interim, my mother's father, my maternal grandfather, died. And my grandmother was grieving and so forth. And my mother, who was a very aggressive political person in her own right, decided that her mother needed to do something, get her mind off the loss of her husband. So she went to my father and said, "My dear, you're leaving the Senate, and my mother's going to run for your seat," which is what he did. My dad went back to his law firm in Manchester, and then let's see, 4 years later, he was elected to Congress. What's really coincidental is my father is 40. He's dead now, but is 40 years older than me. He was elected to the state senate in 1948. I was elected to the state senate in 1998. 40 years later, I was the same age he was. He was elected to the Congress in 1954. I was elected to the Congress in 1994, exactly 40 years later. We didn't plan it that way, but that's the way it turned out. And for me, it was wonderful having my father be so involved in watching me in the Congress. And I will only give you one little story. My dad always would say, "Why can't you?" This is the Gingrich era now. "Why can't you guys get along?" When I was in Congress, I got along with Sam Rayburn. He was a great speaker, and McCormick was good, and Henry Royce, who was chairman of the banking committee. We would house up together in the summertime when everybody else was gone. We worked together. I said, "Dad, in the 10 years that you were in Congress, how many pieces of legislation that you introduced actually passed?" And he looked kind of stunned, and he said, "None." I said, is that what you call a working bipartisanship?" And then he cut me off. He said, "No, actually, one bill passed. It was designating the Cathedral of the Pines in Jaffrey, New Hampshire, a historical monument. That's it."
A good bipartisan bill.
And
So
that's
you
what Newt
mentioned
Gingrich did. He changed that because
totally, yeah,
he brought winning back into the dictionary of the Republican Party.
winning and a lot of fighting as well, for sure.
Correct.
So your father, as I understand it, and you correct me if I'm got my facts wrong, your father represented Dartmouth, and you represented Dartmouth four
Correct.
decades later.
Correct. Yes,
A-
absolutely.
And how was it difficult? Were you? I know it's 40 years, but still, were there people that?
My father represented Hanover and Concord and Ringe, where all, and Keene. He carried all those towns big time. When I was elected to Congress, it was the exact opposite. Oh, and he'd get killed in the city of Nashua. Everything is 180 degrees. I would lose Hanover, Dartmouth College Town, where I went to college, 3-1. Concord, 2-1. I carry Nashua, an old mill city, the southern part of the state, and so everything became reversed, and it was totally different. Of course, the population was roughly almost twice for me what it was for him when he was first elected. So it's a very different and changing political environment here.
Now, I have heard it said that you've been called the insider who wasn't. Uh, that you once joked that your time at St. Albans and your
St.
various
Albans.
St. Albans, thank you very much. You more than once you've corrected my pronunciation, so it's appropriate that you do that today. Uh, and your various business ventures. I know that you had a lot of business ventures in the district there in D.C. You always said it didn't hurt me in Peterborough because I knew how to shovel snow. So, Charlie, you've got deep DC roots, but you always campaigned like someone who you knew every diner in New Hampshire.
All right.
How did you balance being an
All right.
insider
Well,
and
first of
and
all,
and keeping that base in New Hampshire?
first of all, the base was ever changing. New Hampshire has really three parties. The Democratic Party, which is the smallest, I believe now it's about 28% of the registered voters. The Republican Party, which is about 32%, and the remainder are now unaffiliated. And the reason for that is, frankly, Judd Gregg and I get either the credit or the blame for this. Uh, we were able to exempt New Hampshire from the motor voter law. I think motor voter is a horrible idea, and he agreed. But as part of that process, we had to agree to pass a bill that would allow same day voter registration. So what has happened in New Hampshire is if you're a registered Republican, you can only vote Republican in a primary, and the same for the Democrats. But if you're unaffiliated, you can pick up a ballot, vote either side in a primary, and then go back to your party as you walk out of the voting place. So the independent vote is boutique, and that voting block, which is the biggest one in the state, swings back and forth. And my political career was based upon where those independents voted. I was swept in 1994 by the independents. I was swept out in 2006 by the independents. I was swept back in 2010 and then out again. And that's basically been the MO or the paradigm here in New Hampshire that determines who's going to represent the state. Now, the state is more especially my old district, the western side of the state, more democratic than it was today. It's more than it was then. But Tim, I did bring one picture along with you just to show you how far back I go in politics. And I don't know whether I can show this to you, whether I'm allowed to, but it's a picture of me. Here we go. Let's see if you can see it.
Oh,
Looking
we can see it. We oh yes,
rather
we
unhappy at the age of 10, campaigning for my father, who was running for the U.S. Senate in the OK Fairbanks parking lot, putting a bumper sticker on some old codger's car. And this is a Boston Globe photograph. And you'd have to say that I don't look like I'm particularly enjoying myself.
no, no, Charlie, you
That was
don't look like you're enjoying politics at that moment. But how old were you in that picture?
10 years old. And while all my friends were playing and having fun and swimming and everything else, I was there in a pair of shorts and a tie and jacket in the broiling heat in August, uh, bamboozling people to put bumper stickers on their cars. And they didn't, even this guy who had a horrible car, they didn't want to because they were afraid they couldn't get them off. So I would tell them that the bumper stickers were this newfangled version that was made out of plastic and they could come off in one piece. Well, okay, you can put one on because the guy figured he could tear it off 10 minutes later, but they never did because they never got around to doing it. So the whole thing worked. The county fair,
all of
same.
us who have family who followed us into politics can relate to what we put our children through sometimes.
Oh,
I'm not sure you did that with Jonathan and your kids, but I was pretty rough on mine on the political side.
yeah, I have to admit that I did not subject my. Well, first of all, when I was first elected, my
Feel free to
children were
light that
ages 1 and
cigar up.
3.
Feel free to light
Oh,
that
what?
cigar. I've got one here, and I'm going to light it up as soon as this conversation's over. But
Yeah,
feel
yeah.
free. This
See,
is the Cigar Caucus.
you see,
Now, you
this is.
mentioned that you
Mhm.
experienced defeat more than once. How did you handle defeat as a politician? I think that is one of the. I only had it once at the end, but it is traumatic sometimes for the voters to turn you out. Did
It
you ever
isn't
have?
traumatic, and sometimes it's traumatic all the time. I've been on the ballot 31 or 32 times in New Hampshire, when you include the legislature, the state senate, and the U.S. Congress. I was always opposed in primary, so you figure 2 per year, and all that. I've lost not one election, but I've lost 3. I lost my Senate seat in a state Senate seat in a primary. Thank goodness in 1992, because I never would have run for Congress in 94 if I hadn't been out of office. I was defeated again in 2006 and then once again in 2012. And, there's nothing like experiencing being alone than it is at 11 or 12 at night when you know the jig is up and you have to go out there and say something to your supporters. And you can't say God, like Davy Crockett said in Tennessee when he lost for Congress. He said, "The hell with you, I'm going to Texas." You can't say that. You have to say, "Oh, I'm so happy to see you all
Well,
here."
I'll tell you this: when I lost my Senate race in 2002, I had a call from a former colleague in the House. I won't mention his name, but he'd run for the Senate and lost, and he was calling to comfort me. He was going to try to encourage me. And he said, "Tim, I'm sitting here alone eating lunch." And then he kind of paused. He said, "I can remember when they were lining up to have lunch with me, when I had 100 invitations I had to go through, but I'm here alone today. Don't have a friend in the world." And I'm thinking, he's trying to encourage me. but you're right. Losing a race. Go ahead.
So get this one. In 1994, I clobbered Dick Sweat. He was a 2-term incumbent Democrat. Very rare for the district that time to have a Democrat. It was a nasty campaign. I was a real attack dog. It was awful. Fast forward to, and he admitted that I had really just kneecapped him. In 2006, when I lost to Paul Hodes, a day later, the phone rings in my car and I pick it up and it's Dick Sweat. And he said, "Hey, Charlie, this is Dick." I said, "I know it's Dick." And then there was a dead silence. And then he started to giggle and I started laughing and we couldn't stop laughing. He said, "How does it feel? How does it feel?" I said, "Terrible."
So we have visited many, many times, and on many occasions, more than once, you have mentioned a former U.S. Senator from New Hampshire by the name of Norris Cotton. And
Yeah.
I've studied him a little bit, but he must have been a very colorful character. Tell us a little about your connection to Norris Cotton.
Well, he preceded my father. No, he didn't. He was in the U.S. Senate when my father was in Congress. Norris Cotton came from Warren, New Hampshire, way up in northern Grafton County. He was a lay lawyer. He read himself into the law in New Hampshire. Never went to law school. He lived in Lebanon, New Hampshire. He was a big, huge guy, hulking fellow with big jowls and his hair slicked back.
He
But
dressed
the
very
wonderful thing
conservatively, right?
he dressed quite flamboyantly, actually. He was known to wear, for example, a tuxedo onto the Senate floor on occasion or some such thing. And and But what he was best known for were these incredible stories, none of which you are going to hear now. But his speeches had names, and people would come from far and wide to listen to him talk because he was such a good storyteller. And these were political tales about senators who got into trouble and did this and that. By the way, politicians are very good at kind of exaggerating a little bit on occasion.
Yeah, you
Well,
think?
when I ran for Congress for the first time in 1980, Judd Gregg ended up winning the primary. I was only 27 years old. And I went up to see Norris Cotton, and he had known obviously my father well. He'd served with him and so forth. And started ranting about how Jimmy Carter was corrupt and he was ineffective, and the country was going down the tubes. And his brother Billy Carter was a drunk, and he had this beer thing, and he was polluting the White House. And I know you have to elect people that can support good candidates like Ronald Reagan, and on and on and on and on. And Cotton sat there behind his desk very quietly. And when I was finished, he said, "Young Charles, I have but one thing to say to you. And it's this old saying. It goes as follows. My grandpa in his house of logs said the world is going to the dogs. And his grandpa in the Flemish bog said the world is going to the dogs. And his grandpa in his leather thongs said the world is going to the dogs. I can something but state those dogs have had a damn long wait." And I was just crushed. I was just crushed. What do you say? I had made this big spiel and passioned about how I was the only way that the country was at the. So think about today. There are people that think that democracy is at its twilight, and maybe true, but those dogs are still waiting. They're still waiting.
I think the U.S. Senate, maybe not so much the House, but the U.S. Senate is not near as colorful as it was in the Norris Cotton days. The 50s to the 70s he served, and but very entertaining, very, as you said, flamboyant and colorful, and we have a few like that. But the mean-spiritedness is more characteristic than what we saw with Norris Cotton. So
Well, Tim,
yes,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, I'm
Well,
curious.
the people tend to say they've never seen such rancor and anger and discord and mean conversation and so forth. But bear in mind that most of the real violence that has occurred in the U.S. Capitol involving members of Congress with each other was in the 19th century, not the 20th or the 21st century. And when I give Capitol tours, and you've been on them before because we've done them together, there's a great story about a congressman who shot a reporter on the steps going from the second floor to the third floor, or maybe the first floor to the second floor on the House side. He shot him dead because the reporter had slandered him. And the congressman died. His name was Talby from Kentucky, and the reporter's name was Kincaid. They were both in their 30s, and Kincaid went on trial, and he was acquitted. That self-defense.
Well, you're absolutely right that we've always had violence as a part of our political
Unfortunately,
culture in this country, but I think that there is a coarseness today in the
yeah.
dialogue and the communications between people that encourages violence. I'm afraid. I hope, and that's why I think what we're doing on the Cigar Caucus is important, is because we can show that people who disagree can still have a civil discourse and a friendship relationship.
Yes. Well, and I don't mean to get into an issue like that, but just the other day when we were on the phone, we had a discussion about whether Charlie Kirk is racist. And that's a pretty tough subject to debate amongst Republicans and Democrats. And I thought it was pretty substantive because there was an issue which was aired about what is the definition of racism and so forth.
Right.
And I think that's a legitimate type of debate. And by the way, Albert Wynn, who's African American, former member of Congress from Montgomery County, Maryland, he's on the call. So this is not just a bunch of old white guys debating each other.
Right.
It's a pretty diverse crowd.
To be continued. Join us on the next episode of the Cigar Caucus as Congressman Charles Bass and Senator Tim Hutchinson dive deeper into the real life of a congressman and his passions.